Good afternoon. We're going to tell you the story today of this book, the Memento Mori book. In the spring of 2018, as the brand new director of this museum, the Stanley-Whitman House Museum, Andy Verzosa was getting his feet wet and attending to a lot of other issues that were more pressing than historical research. Then, after about 3 or 4 months of his tenure, one Wednesday morning, we, the Fab Four of the research group, Paul Kramer, Shara Palmer, Kate Rodgers, and I, were sitting in the research library, wondering, why doesn't he give us something to do? And he came downstairs and asked what we were doing. And we told him, we're waiting for you to give us a project to do. Aha! He had mistakenly thought that we were also busy with our own previous projects, that he did not want to interfere with those. But that wasn't true at all. So he asked us for ideas of what to do in the future, and all 5 of us came up with lists of proposed projects. We all liked the idea of doing vignettes about some of the people buried in the old Memento Mori cemetery, because Stanley-Whitman had just recently been given the responsibility of managing that burial ground. Thus, this project was born. It is my recollection that in the beginning, we thought it would result in maybe a journal, maybe a few articles in a newsletter, or perhaps as fodder for the playlets that some of the other volunteers were doing then in the cemetery. But we never envisioned a book. And yet, here we are a few years later with this book. After starting with the idea of doing 50 vignettes, we quickly realized that that was way more than we had time to do. So our first nebulous list of subjects was about those 50 people, was quickly pared down to 30 people. We each picked out the people that we thought should be done. And our priorities were anyone closely connected with the Stanley-Whitman House, anyone who was really prominent in the town, and anyone with an unusual story that needed fleshing out with more information. We wanted to learn more about certain people, but we quickly realized that some of our potential subjects had almost no source material available that had not already been discovered and reported by earlier researchers. For those subjects, we could at least pull together everything known and make a coherent, interesting story out of it. For our subjects, each one of the 4 of us promoted our favorites. Cheryl wanted to tell publicly the story of Mary Root, a successful, unmarried lady who lived at a time when every woman was supposed to be married. Paul touted the significance of the unappreciated William Judd and what he did in this town in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and he was right when we started researching William Judd. Kate wanted to tell more about Peter Curtis than just his being superintendent of Newgate Prison. He had a life here in Farmington, and she wanted to show that. And I wanted to make sure that we included enough of the prominent people and local citizens who are buried in Memento Mori that we didn't end up having a group of local historians coming to us afterwards and saying, well, why didn't you include so-and-so? So we started doing the research, and we did them mostly one by one, meeting once a week to share information and new discoveries, deciding what chores each of us would do in the intervening days, who would look up what, who would do an internet search, who would verify odd pieces of information that someone else had found. We wanted to collect every little factoid or crumb of history that we could find about a person, and then try to make a good story out of it. Kate quickly became designated as the author because she's the best writer of the 4 of us. We all did various research jobs. Paul was a very good internet searcher, and he knew how to separate the accurate information from the junk that's out there. He could make very logical inferences, and he did it until the day he died and left us on the research team. Shara has been reading diaries and account books for over 40 years. She's an expert in old handwriting. She has a memory like a steel trap, and she has a card file at home that's a treasure trove of information, references where to find data about people. Her memory gave us lots of little crumbs of information to check out, and her card files told us where to go to find them. Take a look at Shara's style in our first illustration. If you look at this photograph, this is Shara's copy of Man Waring, a standard reference for the Hartford probate records. Every post-it note in there refers to some piece of information about a Farmington person, and there's probably a file card to match it in her file. Kate has a special membership with Ancestry.com that furnished us with the best available genealogical information. And she was very, very good at finding information on the internet that was outside the Connecticut area geographically. My job was to dig into the records at Town Hall or in the Farmington room of the library, especially the land and vital records, to verify certain information and to make sure that dates were correct and made chronological sense. It's very embarrassing to report that a certain person did something, later find out that that person was already dead, or that someone else got married when they were 6 years old. We didn't want that to happen. We've tried to be as accurate as possible with all of our data. I'm now going to turn you over to Kate Rodgers, our author, who will detail for you how we found pieces of information, where we looked, what some of our interpretations were, and how some of these stories came to be. What's remarkable to me is that Kate doesn't even live in Farmington. She comes up here every week from Monroe to volunteer and to help us learn more and interpret more accurately information about this town. You can read her short biographical sketch in the book, which tells quite a bit about her, but it doesn't talk about her ability to bring a dispassionate outsider's point of view to our discussions, or her skill at analyzing the psyche of a person who lived 200 years ago and then telling that person's story with feeling. So here's our author, Kate Rodgers.
Hi, my name is Kate Rodgers, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the actual people who are buried in Memento Mori. A lot of the people that are buried there are very important, iconic names that are the heavy hitters and the more well-known residents of Farmington. Judah Woodruff with his soaring steeple of the church, Solomon Whitman, who was an important clerk and gave his name to this house, Thomas Smith, who was the second resident of this house and a professional weaver. A loom similar to his is upstairs. They're all in this book and all in Memento Mori, but most of the individuals I would like to mention today are the less celebrated residents. So it's my hope that this book will make these people real and will bring them alive so they become more than just scattered facts and lists and documents. The biggest part of this research for me was bringing together all the scattered pieces of information from literally dozens of sources. And just to give you an idea of some of the sources we consulted, because I know some people are interested in how we found what we found about these people. We looked at family genealogies, we looked at land records, we looked at church records, wills and probate papers, inventories, suits, they love to sue each other, manumission and sale papers for slaves, account books, newspapers, obituaries, books, a whole raft of books published during the 1800s about people that had lived previously, histories of other states and areas where you would find some amazing information that you didn't expect to find, magazines, speeches, letters, military records, public documents. There are also wonderful internet sources, Ancestry, Find a Grave, Genealogy Bank, which is newspapers, the Internet Archive, Hathy Trust, most of them very reliable. And usually what was important was when we found something on the internet, we tried to find a primary source document to back that up, and most often we were able to. I'm going to talk about a couple of these people. One of my favorites was Dr. Samuel Whitman, and I know you're not supposed to play favorites, but out of the 23 people I researched, some were simply more interesting than others. Some sort of spoke to me. I felt like if they were around, I'd like to take them out to lunch. And one of my favorites was Dr. Samuel Whitman. I also love his stone in Memento Mori. It's clear, it's readable, and unusually his inscription is carved within a heart that covers the entire stone. Dr. Sam is a good example of a technique that became common when we researched others. He's a great example of how researching individual about whom little concrete information exists makes you research bigger, more universal issues into which you can fit your subject. We knew he was a bone setter, a doctor before there were doctors, but he was so invisible that Paul Kramer did not include him in his very well-researched list of doctors from early Farmington. There is no record of the bone setter with whom he apprenticed, so we don't have those documents. There is no account book, so there is no way to know who he treated or what treatments he gave. Dr. Sam provided the reason to research doctors and medicine in Farmington in the 1700s. So if you bother to look at the sources at the end of this article, you're going to find some sources that have nothing at all to do with Farmington specifically, but do have to do with the practice of medicine at the time. Dr. Sam is also a great example of the value of wills and probate papers. It confirms his work as a doctor by listing many items he owned, such as a pill machine, a scale, and a large needle. His inventory also gives clues to his economic and social position. And this is what makes him come alive for me. He detailed here are all the things that he wore, all the things that he, let me see if I can find it. His inventory also provides clues to the economic and social position Whitman held within Farmington. In addition to the acreage and the land and so forth you would expect to see there, he left a silver watch, a japanned box, a silver tankard, and the black flowered teacup he left his little niece. When he dressed, he chose from several pairs of trousers and leather breeches, multiple shirts, silk handkerchiefs, silk stockings, and at least 10 coats. Samuel wore spectacles, a wig under which he wore one of his 13 linen caps, and on occasion he donned his sword belt or cutlass and carried one of his guns or pistols. He rode a black horse. Quite different from the inventories of some of the other residents of Memento Mori who have in their inventories virtually nothing. You know, one pair of pants and a broken pot kind of thing. And it's that makes him come alive for me. Interestingly enough also, the last item in his inventory was a pelican. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what a pelican was until some researcher said to us, it's a pelican, of course. And we realized that in many of the doctor's studies at that time, there were stuffed birds, and this must be what his pelican was. Another less well-known Farmington resident was named Noadiah Bird. I think Noadiah Bird was one of the most unfortunate of Memento Mori residents. His wife died in childbirth, his infant daughter died a year later, and then Noadiah pretty much disappears from records. There is no mention in Index of Farmington Histories. He joined no committees, no councils, no groups. He ran for no local offices. He never remarried. He is, however, a good example of the value of land records, which is Betty's specialty. The only way we know he stayed in Farmington are through land records. He bought and sold land, although there is no record of his purchasing a home. Land records and his inventory let us conclude that he probably continued to live with his mother in the old family house. Much of our information about Noadiah's death, for which he is sadly best remembered, comes from the Farmington Room blog, Murder Map, which contains original reports of his death from the Hartford Courant. Poor Noadiah was in his house minding his own business when a neighbor came running to his house for help. The neighbor was being pursued by what has been described as a wild man from Bristol. Noadiah opened the door to his neighbor to see what he could do, and the wild man from Bristol decapitated Noadiah at a stroke. So, oddly enough, and outside the scope of this book, the reason this blog has information at all is that a second murder occurred years later at nearly the same spot, and that second murder produced the murder map that's in the Farmington room. And when doing that, they also researched Noadiah, and that's how we know a little bit about him. Another person buried in Memento Mori is Shem. Shem is interesting because he sheds light on the institution of slavery as it was practiced in Farmington during the early 1700s. But his story is more than just a historical piece, and I think it's easily the most touching of all the vignettes, all the people in the book. Shem was a year old. He was a slave. And his stone stands all alone off to the side of Memento Mori. It's a crudely carved field stone, and it shouldn't be there at all. Gravestones for slaves were very rare in Connecticut, and children usually had no markers either. So the question becomes, who erected the stone? Why was the stone there? What we did know about Shem came from records of his parents, largely bills of sale and manumission papers. The Farmington land records record the birth of this child, Shem, on September 4th in 1737. The same records recall the death of their child, Jesse, on December 18th, 1738. We assumed that Noah and Dinah had a second child, named Jesse, until we realized that Jesse's death date was the same as the death date for Shem on Shem's tombstone. Despite the two names, and despite what we had expected, this was indeed the same little boy. It would appear that the name Shem had been his parents' choice, but did not remain. Sometime after Shem's birth, someone, undoubtedly his owner, had changed his name to Jesse. But after his death, and sometime before the erection of the small marker, Jesse's name had been changed back to Shem. The biblical translation of Shem is son of Noah, and his stone stands as evidence of the love and pride that Noah, his father, must have had in his small son. Only in death could Noah lay absolute claim to the baby. The stone reads Shem, Negro son of Noah. It is unlikely that Noah himself could have carved the stone, but the words are surely his own. 9 years later, Noah and Dinah were freed by their owner, and 3 years after that, they left Farmington. So who erected the stone? When? Who carved the inscription? We just don't know. But we like to think that Noah would be pleased every time somebody notices the stone of his little son. I'm not going to tell you all the statistics, all the numbers, all the birth dates and death dates and everything of many of these people, but just try to pick out a couple of the more interesting ones and the more interesting things that they did. Martin Bull, remembered for doing a little bit of everything. He is a goldsmith who left beautiful spoons, some of which we have here in the archives. He also produced several thousand dozen metal coat buttons, the first manufacturer of buttons in the state. He engraved ornate book plates for the new library. And most endearingly, I think, he wrote solemn letters to Farmington youth away at school, giving them the best information he could. They're very gentle, helpful letters, but he's making his point. He paid his bills in cash. He liked to fish with his favorite cane fishing pole. Reverend Timothy Pitkin is also buried here. He has clearly the most elaborately carved stone of Memento Mori. He was 33 years the pastor of Farmington's church and is credited, among other things, for bringing sophistication to the country village. Pitkin came from a wealthy and prominent family. He was the son of a governor, studied Greek and Latin at Yale, and married the daughter of Yale's president. I know that this is hardly the most important thing Pitkin did in his 33 years as pastor, but I especially like this picture of his arrival in Farmington with his new wife to take up the pastorate of the church. There's a crowd waiting excitedly for Pitkin's arrival. I mean, there are new ministers coming in there. They're all out there in force. But an article in the Connecticut Current describes the people of Farmington at that time as quite secluded and simple in their manners. The Pitkins, in all their glory, arrived in a carriage, which was the first carriage that the people of Farmington had ever seen, and the greeting committee, says the Current, were sorely puzzled to know what this might be. Pitkin was a fervent patriot who visited the revolutionary camps, showed unusual compassion when he advocated for Matthias Leeming and officiated at the funeral of Judah Woodruff. These people had been banned from the church and had a lot of problems in the village, and but Reverend Timothy Pitkin advocated for them. It's also interesting that Phyllis Wheatley, who was America's first black poet, wrote a well-known poem on the occasion of Pitkin's wife's death. We have two women that we talk about in Memento Mori. One is Mercy Bidwell. Mercy Bidwell is typical of the shadowy figures presented by most Farmington women. It's very difficult to find out information about the women of Farmington. The most noted, indeed. In her life, the most noted thing that we know about her, and really pretty much the only thing we know about her, is that she was struck by lightning and died. And that is Mercy Bidwell. Unlike Mary Root. Mary Root is a most interesting and independent woman whose write-up you should certainly read. She was so unlike Mercy Bidwell. She had money, she had land, she had a job. She's unusual in that. Reverend Joseph Washburn, he was called the healer of dissension. He held weekly meetings in the kitchen for the young people in his parish. He suffered from consumption and he traveled south for his health. He died during a day-long raging storm on Christmas Day and was buried at sea. So Reverend Washburn's monument stands in Memento Mori, but Reverend Washburn himself is not there. Luther Seymour is a respected cabinet maker and a house builder, a librarian and a musician. He was a member of the Conversational Club. The thing that's so interesting about Luther Seymour is he courted his wife at Hospital Rock. Hospital Rock was a flat rock on Rattlesnake Mountain that was used to drop off supplies for Farmington's smallpox hospital. People would go to Hospital Rock, they would be inoculated against smallpox, they would stay there until they were feeling better, I forget how many days it was, and then they would come back to the community. Luther himself had been vaccinated at Hospital Rock, and his name and age are carved there on the rock. Luther Seymour met his wife at Hospital Rock, and her name is also carved there on the rock. Samuel Hooker, second minister, he's the son of Thomas Hooker, who was the founder of Hartford. He married Mary Willette, whose father was the first mayor of New York City. And at their wedding, the famous thing is they did brew a great bowl of punch. Interestingly, Samuel Hooker, in his inventory, did own a nameless Negro servant who was worth 30 pounds. William Judd. Today we would probably call William Judd a liberal in a town filled with conservatives. He held differing political views from most of his neighbors. He graduated from Yale, was a lawyer, taxed as a businessman, and was eventually arrested in Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania, where he went to lead Connecticut forces. The Connecticut forces and the other people having a little battle. Pennsylvania wanted one thing, Connecticut wanted another thing. Poor William Judd was actually arrested. He had very particular views politically and was supposed to speak at the Constitutional Convention. However, the state made accusation against him. Judd insisted on refuting these accusations, wrote a great long document. went to Hartford to read his document, was under such stress that he had to leave, went home, and died the same night. We discovered very little new information that was not already known, is the truth, but we did discover a few new things. Some of the things are what Betty will talk to you about when she discusses Matthias Leeming. One thing we found out was about John Mix, a Yale-educated lawyer and one of Farmington's most influential and productive town clerks, who held the office during what Mabel Hurlburt in her book describes as the town's best and most exuberant years. She also says that every committee, whether for church, state, or town, had John Mix as a member. Before his election as clerk, he fought in the Revolution. After the Battle of Saratoga, the first American win, the cannons captured by the Patriots were dragged to Farmington and stored in John Mix's orchard. What I did discover, and we didn't know before, was that through military records, we found out that Mix had spent the infamous winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge. I mean, everyone knows about Valley Forge, we just had no idea that John Mix was there. This might be the time to mention another amazing research tool that you can use. It's the Record of Service of Connecticut Men, War of the Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican War. It's a huge, big book, but it has amazing examples of military service in there. So those are only some of the people buried in Farmington. There are 23 people in this book, and each of them has a kind of an interesting piece to his story. So I hope you will read them. Thank you.
Now I will finish by telling you about 3 more interesting findings during this project. The first one was about Elizabeth Bodwell, the 7-month-old child who died despite the care of Dr. Eli Todd. What is written about her is only a vague general version of the real story. All of the detailed medical information about Elizabeth's case comes from the Dr. Eli Todd papers in Vermont, which were discovered by Cliff Alderman several years ago, then transcribed by Paul Kramer with help from Charlie Leach. This next illustration that I will show you is a photo of Charlie and Paul in Memento Mori Cemetery during the infrared investigation that Nick Bellantoni did several years ago. It is sad to all of us that all 3 of these men, Cliff, Charlie, and Paul, these inquisitive and industrious men, are now gone from us after all that they did for local history. In a way, this book is a little bit of a tribute to the 3 of them. Elizabeth Bodwell's story is vague due to the restrictions of Connecticut law, which do not allow us to publish specific medical information about any person of any era, no matter how long ago it was. This next illustration I will show you is Todd's paper number 8 in Vermont. Federal law allows the publication of medical information that's over 150 years old, but that law is not recognized in Connecticut, so we could not put any of these details into print. We could only allude to the real story. If you want to know the details, you can read Paul's unpublished paper here at the Stanley-Whitman House, which includes the details from this original Todd paper. Or you can read the computer transcriptions at the Farmington Historical Society. And you can read Elizabeth's vague story here too. You just cannot legally publish any of the medical details unless you go to Vermont and do it there, where it's legal, because they adhere to the federal guidelines. The second story is about Matthias Leeming, who ended up being my favorite subject. He's always been considered the most prominent Tory in Farmington and is buried backwards with a defiant inscription on his grave, the photo of which is on page 56 of the book, in here. We had no idea what we'd find when we started researching Matthias. We spent over 4 months doing the research on this man alone. I'm rather proud of the new information that we've published about him in the book, because it changes, or should change, the attitude that most people have towards him. And yet we are certain that his story is still unfinished, because there's still more to learn about him. Please read his vignette carefully for what we have found, but what remains to be known. As shown in the next illustration, this map of what is now Burlington and Bristol, we now know just about where he lived. He did not live in the village of Farmington. He lived in what is now Burlington, about 2 miles north of Chippens Hill in Bristol. And we know that he moved there only a few years before the Revolution started. We know he attended church in Bristol on Federal Hill, the Anglican Church, and we know that his wife Philothea is buried 7 miles away from him in the Old North Burying Ground in Bristol. That cemetery is on Lewis Street in Bristol, north of Route 6, about a mile west of Jerome Avenue and the Stop and Shop complex. If you go up the long hill on Route 6 after Jerome Avenue, then turn right and wind around to Lewis Street, you'll find the cemetery behind the other, more westerly shopping complex on Route 6, just east of Route 69. We have marked it on the map with a black circle. The essential question for us as researchers became, why is Philothea buried in Bristol where they lived, but Matthias is here in Farmington where they did not live? This question led us to Bristol to look at her grave, and it made one of my lasting memories of this project. First of all, her gravestone has the same carving technique and was obviously carved at the same time as his by the same carver. Secondly, historical research is not always what you expect. Do you think you'll be digging through dusty old papers? Not always. Sometimes you're down on the ground in a graveyard. I cannot find the photo that I took of Shara and Kate, so I will just show you simply the photo of Philothea's grave. This is the next illustration. My recollection is of Shara and Kate, who were down on the ground with various reflectors and pads of paper, waiting for the sun to come around to an angle where they could read the inscription on this stone much better, more clearly. Then, down on their bellies, carefully deciphering the inscription and copying it. After they finished that, they crawled around measuring distances between stones in this cemetery, trying to find clues as to why Philothea is there near their home and church, with plenty of room next to her for Matthias. There's enough room for 2 or 3 other people next door to her. But he supposedly is not there. This is a riddle we've not solved, but we've speculated about it in the vignette. And it would be a good topic for a conversation club debate in the future. Is Matthias really buried in Farmington, or is he out in Bristol with her? I would love to hear a lot of opinions about this one and have some more data. There are things we could learn in the future if we were willing either to pay for another infrared survey of Memento Mori under his grave, see if there are bones there, or travel around New England and go through some other archival materials, things that are not on the internet yet, to investigate statements made in the past about Matthias that we have not yet verified or disproved. The major one is that he went to Nova Scotia during the Revolution, a claim that we cannot confirm or deny, even though we suspect that he did not go. The COVID pandemic hit us in the middle of doing this research in 2020, and many normal avenues of information were closed off temporarily. We've made significant progress with his life story, but someday I'd like to have someone try to finish off our unknowns and flesh out the story of Matthias Leeming. The third and last story is the only vignette that Kate did not write, and it's an example of how one thing often leads to another in historical research. I became quite fascinated by the fact that there are no stones in Memento Mori for many of the early settlers, the proprietors of Farmington and their wives, the people who established this town in the 1600s and died at the end of that century or early in the 1700s. In trying to find out where they are buried, I needed an accurate list and discovered that the published lists of what I thought were the 84 proprieties are not that at all. The most famous one, in Lydia Hughes's Short History of Farmington, was copied from Trumbull's History of Hartford County, and it has not 84, but 92 names on it. And many of the men on that list were not proprietors of Farmington. That list consists of 3 groups: original owners of lots in town, many of whom did not settle here, men who purchased these lots from the original owners and did settle here, and other early settlers. If you want to know who the official 84 proprietors of Farmington are and where that list is, please use the reference at the end of the book, of the article about the missing 23. That tells you exactly where the list is in the town hall records, which is information that badly needed to be published. I now also have an Excel spreadsheet of that list and what happened to the 84 proprietors, which I have also shared with the Historical Society, so they have a copy of it as well. We used this new information to find out where all of these proprietors were buried, and we found that we could not account for 23 of them at all. There's no record of them being buried anywhere. Thus the article, The Missing 23, that I wrote. This group includes Thomas Barnes. He lived right next door to the burial ground. He owned the land originally. He gave it to the town to be the burial ground. But inexplicably, he does not have a gravestone there that has survived, which to me seems unthinkable. So our last vignette is what I wrote about the missing 23, and it illustrates how frustrated a historical researcher can get when there are just no records to prove something that you know in your heart has to be true. And these are our stories of this Memento Mori book, which we hope is a tribute to the people and their roles who are buried there, the people who are buried there and their roles in making this town what it became by the early 1800s, because their lives deserve to be remembered.